Alright, we're live in 3, 2, 1. The little red light flickered on, and I took a deep breath. My hands rested on the smooth, familiar surface of the microphone as I glanced across the table at Melissa. She sat there, radiant as ever, her signature smile wide and welcoming, the same one that had won over millions of listeners. But today, everything felt different. It had only been 3 days since I found those messages. 3 days since the world as I knew it cracked open like a rotten shell. And now, as we sat in the studio for yet another episode of Mind Over Matter, I couldn't look at her the same way. And welcome back to another episode of Mind Over Matter, where we dive deep into the psychology of relationships. Melissa's voice chimed, bright and professional. You'd never guess, would you? That she's been screwing our sound engineer behind my back? I forced a smile, but it didn't reach my eyes. That's right, Melissa. Today's episode is a big one. We've got a fascinating topic. Emotional manipulation in relationships. Her eyes flicked toward me, a flicker of confusion passing through them. This wasn't the topic we'd agreed on. I'd slipped it in last minute and reworked the script just enough to make it seem organic. She couldn't say no, not in the middle of a live broadcast. Not without raising questions. I know, right? Melissa recovered quickly, nodding. It's something that affects so many people without them even realizing it. I could feel the tension build as I settled into my role. But this wasn't just another discussion for me. I wasn't here to inform or educate. I was here to make her squirm. Exactly. A lot of people think manipulation is about power, but sometimes it's more subtle. It's about control, but not always in obvious ways. You know, like when someone uses affection or trust as a weapon. It's almost like they wear a mask, I said, my eyes locking on her. Her smile faltered for a split second. She knew. She could feel something creeping up, but she wasn't sure what. Not yet. And what's worse, I continued, my voice steady, is when the person being manipulated doesn't realize it. When they trust someone so deeply, they believe the lies, the deception. It's cruel, really. There was a pause, just long enough for the silence to feel heavy and uncomfortable. I could see Greg through the glass of the control room, his fingers gliding over the soundboard, completely unaware that this entire episode was about him too. Melissa cleared her throat. Absolutely, Tom. It's heartbreaking when trust is broken in that way. But recognizing it is the first step to healing, right? Her attempt to steer the conversation back to safer ground was obvious, but I wasn't letting go. Right, I said, leaning in closer to the mic. Though sometimes, the damage is already done. The lies, the betrayals, they can change everything. You think you know someone. You share your life with them. And then one day, you find out they've been living a double life. Melissa's face paled, just slightly. She shifted in her seat, her fingers toying nervously with the edge of her notebook. She knew I was close to crossing the line, but she couldn't stop me. Not live, not in front of our listeners. The chat window on my laptop started lighting up with messages. This sounds personal. What's Tom getting at? Is this hypothetical, or? The listeners could feel it. They were catching on. And when you do find out, I continued, ignoring the growing panic in her eyes, what do you do? Do you confront them? Do you expose the truth? Or do you let it fester? Keep it inside, until it poisons everything? Melissa tried to laugh it off, but it came out strained. Well, hopefully, people can find healthier ways to handle that kind of situation. I could almost taste the fear creeping up her spine. The perfect Melissa. The professional, the expert on relationships, who had built her entire career on honesty and emotional intelligence. And here she was, in the spotlight, with the truth dangling above her like a sword. Hopefully, I said, leaning back and letting the silence stretch between us. I could see the cracks forming in her composure, and that was all I needed for now. As we wrapped up the episode, her usual bubbly energy was gone. She seemed distracted, uneasy. I could feel the shift between us, a shift that the listeners, too, had undoubtedly picked up on. But this was only the beginning. As soon as the broadcast ended, Melissa stood up, avoiding my eyes as she quickly gathered her things. Greg walked into the room, headphones slung around his neck, oblivious to the tension swirling around us. Great episode, guys, he said, giving us both a thumbs up. I smiled. Thanks, Greg. You really nailed the sound today. Melissa shot me a sharp look, her eyes narrowing for just a moment before she forced a tight smile. She knew what I was doing now. But it was too late. This was just the start of my game. And Melissa had no idea what was coming next. It was late when I found the texts. One of those random moments where the universe decides to punch you in the gut when you least expect it. Melissa had left her phone on the kitchen counter, the screen glowing softly in the dark. A message popped up from Greg. "Can't stop thinking about last night. When can I see you again?" My chest tightened as if someone had kicked me square in the ribs. I blinked, unable to process the words at first. I swiped the screen open, my hands trembling, and there they were. Messages I never wanted to see. "Greg, I miss your touch." "Melissa, soon, baby. Same place tomorrow?" I scrolled up. Weeks of messages, photos, inside jokes, secret meetings in hotels, all while we sat in front of microphones every week, talking about honesty and trust in relationships. The irony was suffocating. Melissa, my wife, and my partner in work and life, was lying right to my face. And not just with anyone, with Greg, the guy we trusted to make us sound perfect. I could hear her upstairs, humming as she got ready for bed. I stared at the screen, my mind racing. Part of me wanted to march up there, throw the phone at her, and demand an explanation. But the other part, the colder, calculating part, told me to wait. There was power in patience. I put the phone back exactly where I found it, grabbed a glass of water, and leaned against the counter, staring blankly at the tiled floor. My mind started turning over the possibilities. How do you confront something like this? How do you dismantle a life you've built with someone who's been dismantling it behind your back? By the time I went to bed, my mind was set. I wasn't going to blow this up. Not yet. There was a better way to handle this. I was going to let her feel the consequences of her actions, in the one place she thought she had full control, our audience. Chapter 3, Laying the Trap. The next few days passed in a haze. Melissa didn't seem to notice that anything was off, though I wasn't sure if that was because she was too wrapped up in her affair or because she'd become so used to hiding things. I watched her carefully. Every touch, every smile felt rehearsed, like she was playing a role in some twisted drama. I hated her for it, but I wasn't going to give her the satisfaction of knowing that. Instead, I threw myself into the next episode of the podcast, carefully crafting every word of the new script. Emotional manipulation. It was perfect. The more I thought about it, the more it made sense. Melissa had been manipulating me for months, pretending like everything was fine while sneaking around with Greg. And now, I was going to turn the tables. I didn't tell her about the change in topic until the day of the recording. She seemed surprised but didn't question it. She never questioned me when it came to work. Maybe she was too confident in her own ability to charm her way out of any situation. She had no idea what I had planned. That morning, I arrived at the studio early. Greg was already there, setting up the sound levels, oblivious to the storm brewing right in front of him. I watched him for a moment. This guy who had been sneaking behind my back with my wife, and I felt a sick twist of satisfaction. He had no idea that by the end of today, everything would change. "Morning, Greg," I said, my voice neutral. "Hey, Tom, ready for today's episode?" he asked his usual cheery self. "Oh, more than ready," I replied, forcing a smile. "It's going to be a good one." He grinned, adjusting the mics. "You guys always come up with such great topics. Emotional manipulation, huh? That'll get people talking. Quote. I could barely contain myself. If only he knew how true that was. When Melissa arrived, she was in her usual high spirits, flashing that perfect smile. The one that was apparently for everyone, not just me. I felt my stomach churn, but I stayed calm. Today wasn't about anger, it was about control. As we started the recording, I followed the usual format. Melissa did her part, effortlessly engaging with the audience, while I waited for the right moment. And then, halfway through, I took my shot. "You know," I said, leaning into the mic, "emotional manipulation is often so subtle, it can be happening for months before the victim even realizes it. It's not just about lying. It's about making someone question their own reality." Melissa's smile flickered for a second. She glanced at me, just a little too quickly, before she caught herself. "It's true," she said, her voice a bit too steady. "Manipulators can be so good at hiding their actions that the person being manipulated doesn't even notice the signs." Quote. Exactly, I continued, my gaze fixed on her. Like when someone's living a double life. They act like everything's fine, like they're trustworthy, but behind the scenes, they're betraying the very person they claim to love. Melissa froze. It was subtle, but I saw it. The moment she realized I wasn't talking in hypotheticals anymore. Her fingers twitched, her usual confident demeanor wavering. I let the silence hang for just a beat longer than usual, enough for the tension to creep through the speakers. "And when you finally figure it out," I said, my voice low, "what do you do? Do you confront them? Or do you let it unravel naturally, piece by piece until they destroy themselves?" I could almost hear the gears turning in her head. She wasn't sure if this was just me being dramatic for the show or if I knew. If I had seen the messages. If I had already pulled the thread. "Well," she said, forcing a laugh that sounded hollow, "hopefully, people can find a way to work through those issues before it gets that far." I didn't respond. I just let the air between us fill with unspoken tension, the kind that our listeners were bound to notice. And they did. The live chat on my screen was lit up with comments. "Is Tom talking about himself? This feels really personal." Melissa's eyes flickered toward the chat window. She was starting to see it too, the subtle shift in tone, the growing unease. For the first time since I'd found out about her affair, I felt in control. She was on edge, and it was only going to get worse from there. As we wrapped up the episode, she barely made eye contact with me. Greg, still clueless, walked into the studio, giving us his usual thumbs up for a job well done. Melissa forced a smile, but her face was pale, and I could see the panic building behind her eyes. This was just the beginning. After the recording, Melissa barely spoke. She packed up her things quickly, avoiding my gaze, and left the studio with a muttered excuse about needing to run some errands. I watched her go, the click of her heels echoing in the hall. As Greg gave me a friendly wave from the control room, he had no idea that his little affair had just been broadcast to thousands of listeners, wrapped in metaphors and subtle accusations. Good. Let him stay in the dark a little longer. I walked to my car, the satisfaction of that day's episode still pulsing through me. For the first time since I'd found out about Melissa's betrayal, I felt like I had the upper hand. The comments kept rolling in on social media, listeners debating whether we were still playing within the realm of hypotheticals or if I had just cracked open something real. That got intense fast. "Is Tom okay? The way he looked at Melissa, anyone else get chills? I think something's going on behind the scenes. He sounded too personal. They were on to us, and it was only a matter of time before they started piecing it all together." I kept scrolling through the flood of messages, reveling in how quickly the tide was turning. It wasn't just about punishing her anymore, it was about control, about reminding Melissa that she wasn't the only one capable of deception. The first crack in her perfect image had formed, and I was going to make sure it split wide open. Later that night, we had dinner in silence. Melissa picked at her food, her usual witty remarks gone. She didn't ask about the episode and didn't make any comments about how she thought it went. I could see the tension in her shoulders and the way her hands tightened around the fork. She was scared, and I loved it. "You seemed a bit distracted today," I said finally, taking a sip of my wine. She glanced up at me, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Yeah, well, you kind of threw me off with the topic change." "I thought it was a good discussion," I said, setting my glass down. Emotional manipulation is something we've never really explored in depth before. Her lips twitched, almost a grimace. "Yeah, well, it got pretty intense. I think the listeners liked it," I said, my voice calm. "They were really engaged." She didn't respond, her eyes dropping back to her plate. I could see it, the internal battle she was having. She wanted to ask me if I knew if I had been hinting at something, but she couldn't bring herself to say it. "Not yet." Good, let her stew. The following week, the tension between us was palpable. Melissa was more withdrawn than usual, avoiding any real conversation. She spent a lot of time on her phone, texting someone, probably Greg, though she'd become more careful about leaving it unattended. I didn't confront her, though. I didn't need to. The plan was already in motion. When the next episode came around, I knew exactly what I was going to do. The last one had been a subtle jab, but this time I was going to twist the knife a little deeper. I had rewritten the script again, carefully crafting it so that Melissa wouldn't notice the trap I was setting until it was too late. "Welcome back to Mind Over Matter, everyone," I said as the red light flickered on. Today, we're diving into a particularly sensitive topic: trust and betrayal in relationships. Melissa shot me a sharp look. But it was too late to object. We were live. "Trust is the foundation of any relationship," I began, leaning in toward the mic. "Without it, everything falls apart. But what happens when that trust is broken? When the person you thought you knew better than anyone turns out to be living a lie?" I saw her stiffen in her chair. The look of discomfort that flickered across her face was priceless. She hadn't expected this. Not again. Sometimes, I continued, my voice steady and calm, betrayal doesn't come from a stranger. It comes from the person closest to you. The one you trust with your deepest secrets, your future. It's not just the betrayal itself that hurts, it's the fact that you never saw it coming. Melissa shifted in her seat, her eyes darting toward the chat window. I could tell she was hoping the listeners hadn't picked up on it yet, but they had. The messages started pouring in almost immediately. Is this about Melissa? Tom sounds pissed off. What's going on? Did something happen between them? The tension in the studio was thick, almost suffocating, but I wasn't done yet. I had one more card to play, and I was going to make it count. The worst part, I said, my voice dropping just a little, is that betrayal doesn't always end when you find out the truth. It lingers. The lies, the secrets, they fester. They change everything about how you see the person, and how you see yourself. And sometimes, it's too late to fix it. Melissa was pale now, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She couldn't stop me. Not with the audience hanging on every word, waiting for the next revelation. Greg's face appeared through the glass window of the control room, as oblivious as ever, nodding along like he was listening to some academic lecture. I wondered how he'd react when he realized this was all about him, too. But that was a problem for later. We wrapped the episode in strained silence. The moment the recording stopped, Melissa stood up abruptly and walked out of the studio without a word. Greg shot me a confused look, but I just smiled and shrugged, pretending like nothing was wrong. But everything was wrong, for her. Melissa's carefully constructed world was crumbling, and I was the one tearing it down piece by piece. The audience was talking, speculating, and it wouldn't be long before someone connected all the dots. I left the studio that day feeling lighter than I had in weeks. This was just the beginning, and with every episode, and every carefully chosen word, I was getting closer to the point of no return. And Melissa had no idea how much worse it was going to get. By the time the next episode aired, the whispers were no longer whispers. Social media was buzzing with theories. Listeners dissected every word, every glance Melissa and I exchanged on camera. Some thought I was just being dramatic for the sake of the podcast, a well-timed ploy to generate more engagement. Others, though, had already guessed the truth. I could see it on Twitter and in the YouTube comments. Is Tom hinting at something real? What's going on with Melissa? Some fans had even pulled screenshots from our episodes, zooming in on the tension between us. They shared clips of my cold, hard stare juxtaposed with Melissa's forced smiles. It was all starting to unravel, and I hadn't even revealed the full extent of the betrayal yet. Melissa, of course, was oblivious. She avoided the comments and stayed out of the online conversations, as she always did. She thought our fans adored her too much to ever turn on her. She was wrong. They were already questioning her, and the cracks in her perfect persona were becoming harder to ignore. At home, things were worse. Melissa was distant, distracted, as if she was on autopilot. Her phone was always glued to her hand now, and she barely looked up when I spoke. But I wasn't bothered. In fact, I enjoyed watching her squirm. Every day, she grew more paranoid, sensing something was off but unable to confront it. The week after our latest episode, we were scheduled to attend a live event. It was a big deal, AQ. Normally, Melissa thrived in these settings, basking in the admiration of our audience. But this time, the tension between us was unavoidable. And I knew, without a doubt, that some of the more curious fans were going to ask questions we weren't prepared to answer. The venue was packed, the buzz of anticipation filling the air. I could feel Melissa's unease as we sat on stage, the bright lights shining down on us, making it impossible to hide our discomfort. She kept smiling, the same plastic grin she'd been using for weeks now. But her hands fidgeted in her lap. The moderator kicked things off with some basic questions about our podcast success, our thoughts on relationships, and the usual small talk. But it didn't take long for the real questions to surface. A woman in the crowd raised her hand, standing up as the microphone was passed to her. "Hi, I'm a huge fan of the podcast," she began, glancing nervously between us. I wanted to ask, there's been a lot of talk online about the last few episodes. People are saying they feel really personal. Like, the discussions about betrayal. It seems like it's coming from a real place. Is everything okay between you two? Melissa froze. For a second, I thought she might actually get up and leave, but she forced a laugh instead. "Oh, people always read into things. We're fine," she said quickly, her voice higher pitched than usual. "We just like to keep things interesting for our listeners." I smiled, but I didn't rush to back her up. Instead, I let the silence linger just long enough to make it awkward. I think sometimes when you're talking about emotional topics like betrayal and trust, it's hard not to bring personal experiences into it. But, as Melissa said, we're fine. The audience didn't seem convinced, and I could see more hands going up, eager to ask follow-up questions. The moderator, sensing the shift in energy, quickly moved on to the next topic, but the damage had already been done. Melissa's face was tight with barely concealed panic, and I could feel the pressure mounting. She knew. She could feel it now, the walls closing in, the questions she wasn't ready to answer. After the live event, Melissa couldn't hide her frustration anymore. The moment we stepped backstage, her carefully maintained facade crumbled. She rounded on me, her eyes blazing. "What the hell was that, Tom?" she snapped, her voice low but furious. "You just sat there. You let them think something's wrong between us." I shrugged, pretending to be confused. "What do you mean? I thought we handled it fine." She stared at me, disbelief written all over her face. "You've been acting weird for weeks, and now our fans are noticing it too. Are you trying to ruin everything we've built? Because it sure feels like it." I met her glare with cold indifference. "I'm not trying to ruin anything, Melissa. I'm just being honest." "Honest?" she scoffed, crossing her arms. "You've been passive-aggressive and cryptic like you're punishing me for something. But you won't say what. What the hell is going on with you?" I held her gaze, and for the first time, I let the mask slip. "Maybe you should ask Greg that question." Her face went pale. For a second, I thought she might actually pass out from shock. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. She just stared at me, wide-eyed, as the realization hit her. She started, her voice barely above a whisper. "You know." "I know everything, Melissa," I said, my voice low and steady. "The texts, the secret meetings, all of it. You and Greg, behind my back." Her lips parted, but she still couldn't form a coherent sentence. She took a shaky breath, her hands trembling. "Tom, don't bother," I cut her off. "It doesn't matter anymore. I've already made up my mind." Tears welled up in her eyes, and for a moment, I thought she might actually break down. But then, something changed. She straightened her back, her expression hardening into one of defiance. "So, what's the plan here? Do you humiliate me on the podcast? Air our dirty laundry for the whole world to hear? Is that it?" I smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "You humiliated yourself, Melissa. I'm just giving people the truth." She took a step closer, her voice trembling with barely suppressed rage. "You think you're so clever, don't you? That you're in control of this whole situation? But you're wrong. You have no idea how far this could spiral. If you go down this road, there's no coming back." Her words hung in the air, a thinly veiled threat. I stared at her for a long moment, considering what she'd said. She was scared, but she wasn't backing down. "Not yet. Maybe," I said finally, my voice cold. "But I'm willing to take that risk." I turned and walked away, leaving her standing there, alone and trembling with fear and fury. This was the moment I had been waiting for, the moment when the truth was finally out in the open, and there was no turning back. The next episode of Mind Over Matter would be the tipping point, and I was ready to push Melissa over the edge. This game wasn't over yet. The next podcast episode was unlike anything we'd ever done before. I had planned it meticulously, crafting the script with the precision of someone about to detonate a bomb, because that's what this episode was. The final blow. The moment everything would come crashing down. Melissa showed up to the studio pale and silent. She hadn't spoken to me since our confrontation backstage after the live event. She knew what was coming, though she had no idea how deep I intended to cut. Greg was there, as always, setting up equipment, blissfully unaware of the role he had played in destroying my marriage. I sat down at the mic, my heart steady. Melissa took her seat across from me, her eyes darting between me and Greg, panic simmering beneath the surface. She was on edge, but she was still trying to hold on, hoping she could control the damage. But she couldn't. Not this time. As the red light flicked on, I started speaking, my voice calm and steady. "Welcome back to Mind Over Matter. Everyone. Today's episode is going to be a little different. We've talked a lot about relationships, trust, and betrayal in recent episodes, but today, We're going to dive even deeper into what happens when those bonds are truly broken. I saw Melissa tense, her hands gripping the edge of the table. Greg, as usual, nodded along, adjusting levels on the soundboard, completely oblivious. This episode isn't just about hypotheticals, I continued, locking eyes with Melissa. It's about real experiences. It's about betrayal, not as a concept but as something personal. Something that happens in the most trusted relationships. Melissa's eyes widened slightly, but she didn't say anything. I could see the fear in her, the way her carefully constructed facade was cracking under the weight of my words. When someone you love betrays you, I said, my voice steady, it's not just the act itself that hurts. It's the lies, the cover-ups, the manipulation. It's the fact that they can look you in the eye, day after day, and pretend everything is fine. Pretend that you're the one who's imagining things when in reality, they've been tearing apart everything you've built together. I paused, letting the words hang in the air. Melissa looked like she was about to say something, but I wasn't going to let her. And sometimes, I continued, the betrayal is so deep, so intertwined with the fabric of your life, that you don't even see it until it's too late. Until you've been made a fool of, by the person you trusted the most. That's when I dropped the bomb. This betrayal isn't just a story for our listeners. It's my story. It's something I've been living through for months now, right under my nose. Melissa's face went white. Greg looked up from the soundboard, his brow furrowing in confusion. He still didn't get it, but the listeners did. The live chat exploded with messages, a flurry of shock and speculation. Wait, is he talking about Melissa? Oh my god, this is real. Did Tom just admit he's been cheated on? Melissa sat frozen in her chair, her mouth slightly open, eyes wide with disbelief. She knew I was about to expose everything, live, in front of thousands of people. I leaned in, my voice low and measured. You see, when trust is broken, there's no going back. The person who betrayed you may think they can hide it, may think they're clever enough to get away with it. But the truth always comes out. And when it does, there's nothing left. The silence in the studio was suffocating. Melissa looked like she was going to be sick. Greg's confusion turned to alarm as he slowly began to understand what I was saying. I turned to the camera. I want to thank our listeners for being with us through this journey. I didn't expect to be sharing something so personal, but I think it's important for all of you to understand that even people who talk about relationships for a living can be blindsided by betrayal. Melissa shot up from her chair, her face a mask of panic. Tom, stop. You can't. But it was too late. The damage was done. The truth was out, and there was no taking it back. The live chat continued to explode with comments, fans shocked by the sudden turn. They weren't just witnessing a podcast episode anymore. They were watching the collapse of our marriage, unraveling in real time. I think that's enough for today, I said, standing up and removing my headphones. Thank you all for listening. As I left the studio, I could hear Melissa calling after me, her voice desperate and broken. But I didn't stop. I didn't look back. This wasn't over yet. Not by a long shot. The fallout was immediate. The episode went viral within hours, shared, and reposted across every social media platform. Fans of the podcast couldn't stop talking about the shocking revelation. Some were sympathetic, offering me support. Others were furious at Melissa, labeling her a hypocrite for preaching about relationships while betraying her own husband behind the scenes. Melissa tried to do damage control. She posted a statement on our social media accounts, denying everything at first. She claimed it was all a misunderstanding, that I had overreacted, and that our marriage wasn't falling apart. But no one bought it. The more she tried to cover up the truth, the more people dug into our lives, unearthing every little detail they could find. A few days later, Greg called me. I'd been expecting it, though it didn't make it any less satisfying. Tom, he started, his voice strained. Look, man, I didn't know. You didn't know I'd find out? Or you didn't know I'd air it out for everyone to hear? I interrupted, my tone icy. He paused, clearly at a loss for words. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. It just happened. I almost laughed at that. The classic excuse. You mean you didn't mean for me to find out? That's what you're really saying. There was silence on the other end, and I let it hang. Finally, Greg spoke, his voice quieter now. I'm sorry, Tom. I really am. But, what now? You've said your piece, but this is all blowing up way bigger than I think any of us expected. Good, I said. Let it blow up. You and Melissa deserve every bit of what's coming. Greg tried to reason with me, tried to find some way to salvage what was left of his reputation, but I wasn't interested in hearing it. I hung up on him, feeling no remorse. The days that followed were a whirlwind of media attention. Reporters reached out, fans speculated, and Melissa's name became synonymous with public scandal. She lost sponsorships, brand deals, everything she had worked so hard to build came crashing down. I watched it all unfold from the sidelines, detached, like I was watching a show unravel that I'd written myself. And in a way, I had. Melissa reached out to me several times, but I ignored most of her messages. The few times I did pick up, she pleaded with me to stop the chaos, to issue some kind of statement to calm the storm. But I wasn't interested in playing savior anymore. I had spent too long being the good guy, the one who believed in the best of people. Now, I wanted to watch her fall. Eventually, the press cooled down, and the attention started to shift. But the damage was done. Our podcast, once a top-rated show, had lost its core audience. Melissa was a pariah, and even Greg, once her closest confidant, had distanced himself as the full extent of the fallout hit him. As for me, I wasn't sure where I stood anymore. The satisfaction I'd felt in exposing them, in watching everything crumble, had started to fade. I had won, sure, but it was an empty victory. The marriage was over, and so was the life we'd built together. All that was left now were the ashes of what could have been. And as I sat alone in the quiet, I realized something: in destroying her, I'd also destroyed a part of myself. There was no going back. After the storm settled, the silence felt deafening. For the first time in years, I was alone, truly alone. Melissa had moved out, taking the last of her things in a rushed, almost clinical manner. We didn't exchange many words. There was nothing left to say. Everything that could have been said had already been broadcast to thousands of listeners. The podcast was officially over. We never announced a formal end, but it was clear. Sponsors pulled out, listeners stopped tuning in, and the platform pulled our show from their front pages. In the wake of the scandal, Mind Over Matter became a joke. Not the insightful relationship advice show it once was, but the public train wreck everyone had witnessed. I spent the first few weeks in a daze, trying to make sense of what my life had become. I didn't feel regret exactly, but there was a gnawing emptiness that replaced the initial rush of satisfaction I'd felt after exposing Melissa and Greg. Maybe it was the realization that, in my quest for revenge, I had torched everything, leaving no part of my life untouched. My phone had stopped ringing. The texts from friends slowed down, too. Everyone had an opinion about what had happened. Some supported me, while others thought I had gone too far. I didn't care either way. The only voice I heard clearly was my own, the one that asked the same question over and over: what now? One night, about a month after the podcast ended, I sat in my kitchen, staring at the untouched glass of whiskey in front of me. The silence in the apartment was crushing. No more recording sessions, no more content planning. Just me, alone with my thoughts. I hadn't spoken to Melissa since she'd left. She sent me an email once, asking for one final conversation. I didn't respond. What could she possibly say that I didn't already know? The betrayal was done. I had already exacted my revenge. But as I sat there, the anger that had fueled me for so long started to dissolve. What remained was something less sharp, more muted, a kind of exhaustion that settled deep in my bones. I wasn't sure what I wanted anymore. Did I want her to apologize? Did I want closure? Or was I just looking for some way to fill the void? I picked up my phone and stared at Melissa's number, my thumb hovering over the call button. I hadn't deleted her contact yet. Part of me couldn't bring myself to do it. I considered calling, just to hear her voice, to see if there was anything left between us, anything that hadn't been completely destroyed. But I didn't. Instead, I set the phone down and walked away, the quiet of the apartment echoing behind me. I wasn't expecting him. I thought I'd seen the last of Greg after that phone call, but one afternoon, as I was putting the last few boxes of old podcast equipment in storage, there was a knock on my door. When I opened it, there he was, Greg, standing in the doorway with a defeated look on his face. He looked rough, like he hadn't slept in days. His hair was a mess, and his clothes hung loosely on his frame. "Tom," he said, his voice low. "Can we talk?" I almost shut the door in his face, the sight of him reigniting all the anger I thought I had let go of. But instead, I stepped aside and let him in, if only to hear what he had to say. Greg stepped into the living room, glancing around at the bare walls and half-empty bookshelves. The place looked as hollow as I felt. He shifted awkwardly, clearly uncomfortable. I'm not here to make excuses, he began, avoiding my gaze. I know what I did was wrong. I didn't expect things to spiral out like this. Like this? I repeated, crossing my arms. You didn't expect to get caught, Greg. That's the only reason you're standing here. He sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. Yeah, maybe. But I never meant to destroy everything. I don't know. I didn't think it would end like this. I let out a bitter laugh. You didn't think sleeping with my wife would destroy anything? Really? Greg flinched, but he didn't argue. I messed up, Tom. I know that. I needed to talk to you, face to face. I've lost a lot because of this, too. Good, I said flatly. That was the point. He stared at the floor, nodding slowly. I get that, but I didn't come here to beg for forgiveness. I know you'll never give me that. I wanted to say I'm sorry. For everything. The apology hung in the air, awkward and hollow. I didn't know what I was supposed to do with it. Part of me wanted to throw him out, to never see him again. But another part of me, the part that had grown tired of the anger, felt something else. What do you want, Greg? I asked after a long pause. He finally looked up at me, his expression bleak. I don't want anything. I wanted to face you, man to man. I've been thinking about what I did. And I know I can't undo it. But I wanted to own up to it, at least. I studied him for a moment, trying to gauge whether he was being sincere or just trying to save face. He looked broken, just like me, maybe more so. The scandal had cost him his job, his reputation, and whatever fleeting thrill he'd found with Melissa. I'm not going to forgive you, I said finally. But I don't need to carry this around anymore, either. Greg nodded slowly as if he had expected that response. That's fair. We stood there in silence for a moment longer before I finally gestured toward the door. You should go. He didn't argue. With a quiet nod, he turned and walked out, leaving me alone again. But this time, the emptiness felt a little different, less suffocating, more manageable. As the door clicked shut behind him, I realized that maybe, just maybe, this was the first step toward moving on. I wasn't ready to forgive Melissa or Greg. But I was ready to stop letting their betrayal define me. The days after Greg's visit felt different. It was as if the weight I'd been carrying had started to lift, though not entirely. I was still angry, still hurt, but there was clarity now, a realization that clinging to that anger was only poisoning me. I knew what I had to do. I had to speak to Melissa. She had tried reaching out to me several times since the podcast went nuclear, and I had shut her down at every turn. I didn't want to hear her excuses, didn't want to give her a platform to spin her story. But after everything that had happened, and after facing Greg, I knew I couldn't keep avoiding her forever. So, one morning, I texted her. Let's talk. Her response came almost immediately. When? Where? I took a deep breath before replying, our place. Tomorrow evening. It wasn't our place anymore, not really. She had moved out weeks ago, but the apartment still felt like ours in a way. The walls held too many memories, both good and bad. It seemed fitting that we'd have our final conversation there. Where it all started, and where it all ended. The next day, when the doorbell rang, I was ready. I opened the door to find Melissa standing there, looking nervous, her hands fidgeting with the strap of her purse. She looked smaller, somehow like the weight of the world had finally caught up to her. Hey, she said softly, her voice tentative. I stepped aside to let her in. Hey. She walked in slowly, glancing around at the familiar space. For a moment, neither of us said anything. The tension between us was thick, almost suffocating, but I was determined to push through it. Melissa sat down on the couch, and I took a seat across from her. We sat in silence for what felt like an eternity before she finally spoke. I've been trying to figure out what to say, she began, her voice shaky. But I know that no apology is going to fix this. I stared at her, waiting for her to continue. She fidgeted again, clearly struggling to find the right words. For the lies, for betraying you, for ruining everything we had. I know I don't deserve forgiveness, but I needed to say it. I didn't respond right away. I'd imagined this moment so many times, but now that it was happening, I wasn't sure how to feel. There was no satisfaction in hearing her apology, no catharsis. Just a hollow feeling in my chest. I don't understand why, I said finally, my voice calm but tired. Why, Greg? Why throw everything away like that? Melissa looked down at her hands, her face crumpling slightly. I don't know, she whispered. I wish I had an answer. At first, it was just a distraction. A stupid, selfish mistake. But then it kept happening, and I didn't know how to stop. I was scared of what it would mean if you found out. I shook my head, feeling a surge of bitterness rise in my chest. You were scared? You didn't think about how I'd feel? Tears welled up in her eyes, but she didn't look at me. I know I hurt you. I know I destroyed us. And I'll regret it for the rest of my life. The silence that followed was heavy. I could feel the weight of everything we'd lost pressing down on both of us. I'm not looking for you to forgive me, she continued, her voice barely above a whisper. But I wanted you to know that I loved you, Tom. I still do. And I'm sorry I ruined everything. I let her words hang in the air for a long moment. Part of me wanted to believe her, to hold on to the idea that maybe, deep down, she still cared. But another part of me knew that love wasn't enough anymore. It hadn't been enough to stop her from betraying me. It hadn't been enough to keep our marriage intact. I don't hate you, Melissa, I said, my voice low but firm. I'm not sure if I ever did. But I can't keep holding on to this. We're done. And I think we both need to move on. Her face crumpled, and for a moment, I thought she might argue, might beg for another chance. But instead, she nodded, wiping away the tears that spilled down her cheeks. I understand, she whispered. We sat there in silence for a while longer. The finality of our conversation settling in. There was nothing left to say. No more explanations, no more apologies. Just two people who had once loved each other, now sitting in the wreckage of what they'd built together. When Melissa finally stood to leave, I didn't stop her. She walked to the door, pausing for a moment before turning back to look at me. Goodbye, Tom, she said softly. Goodbye, Melissa. And just like that, she was gone. The days after my conversation with Melissa felt strangely lighter. There was no dramatic sense of closure, no moment of profound realization. But there was a shift, a subtle but undeniable change in how I carried the weight of everything that had happened. I wasn't angry anymore, not in the way I had been. The rage, the need for revenge, the constant reliving of the betrayal, it had all started to fade. In its place was something quieter, something closer to acceptance. I wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, I wasn't consumed by the past. I started going for walks in the mornings, a small routine I hadn't done in years. I'd forgotten how peaceful it could be, just walking through the neighborhood as the world slowly woke up around me. One morning, about a week after my conversation with Melissa, I sat down at my computer, staring at the blank screen. I hadn't written anything since the podcast ended and hadn't even thought about starting something new. But as I sat there, I realized I still had things to say. Not about Melissa, not about Greg, not about betrayal, but about life, relationships, and everything that comes after the fall. The podcast had been about relationships, but it had also been about growth, learning from mistakes, and moving forward. Maybe that was something I could still do. I opened a new document and started writing. Slowly at first, unsure of where it would lead, but the words started to flow. I wrote about the podcast, about what had happened, about the lessons I'd learned. But I also wrote about healing, about forgiveness, not just for Melissa and Greg, but for myself. By the time I stopped, hours had passed, and the document had grown into something more than just a reflection. It was a roadmap, not for getting back what I'd lost, but for finding something new. I didn't know what the next step would be, but I knew I was ready to take it. For the first time in months, I felt hopeful. The past was behind me now, and the future, whatever it held, was mine to shape. 6 months had passed since the last conversation with Melissa, and life was slowly finding its rhythm again. It wasn't the life I had planned, the one filled with podcast episodes, relationship advice, and shared goals with my wife. But it was a life that felt like mine now, untethered from the weight of the past. One morning, as I sat on my balcony with a cup of coffee, a thought crossed my mind. Maybe it was time to start something new. The idea of starting another podcast had been circling in my head for weeks, but I wasn't sure if I could return to that world, not after everything that had happened. The fear of repeating the past still lingered, like an invisible shadow. But as I stared at the city below, I realized that mind over matter was just one part of my story. It didn't have to define everything I did moving forward. I wasn't that person anymore, the husband clinging to a crumbling marriage, or the man driven by revenge. I had grown, I had changed, and maybe, just maybe, I had something new to offer. That afternoon, I sat down at my desk and began mapping out ideas. This time, I didn't want to create a podcast about relationships in the traditional sense. I wanted to explore something deeper, the aftermath of relationships, the way we rebuild ourselves after everything falls apart. I wanted to talk about healing, resilience, and finding meaning when the things we thought would last forever shatter before our eyes. I decided on the name After the Storm. It felt right, like a continuation, but also a fresh start. A way to take everything I'd been through and turn it into something positive. Something that might help others who were struggling in the same way I had been. Recording the first episode was strange. I sat in front of the microphone, feeling the familiar weight of nerves and anticipation, but this time, there was no co-host, no Melissa. Just me and the mic. It felt liberating and terrifying all at once. I took a deep breath and started talking. Welcome to After the Storm. I'm Tom, and this podcast is about what comes next, after the betrayals, the heartbreak, the loss. It's about picking up the pieces and finding a way forward, even when everything seems broken. I know what that feels like, and I want to share my story, and the stories of others, to help anyone out there who feels like they're stuck in the wreckage. The words flowed more easily than I expected. I talked about my journey, the mistakes I had made, the lessons I had learned, and the slow process of healing. I didn't mention Melissa by name, but I didn't need to. Anyone who had followed our story would know who I was referring to. But this wasn't about exposing her or rehashing old wounds. It was about moving forward. When I finished recording, I sat back and listened to the playback. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. It was raw, and it was exactly what I needed it to be. Over the next few weeks, I released the episode. The response was slow at first, but soon, messages started coming in. People shared their own stories of heartbreak and recovery. Some of them had been listeners of Mind Over Matter and were curious about my new direction. Others were new faces, drawn to the honesty and vulnerability of the new show. One evening, as I scrolled through the comments and emails, I realized something: I wasn't alone. The pain I had gone through wasn't unique, but my willingness to talk about it was helping others find their own path to healing. I wasn't just moving on. I was building something new. The podcast began to grow, steadily gaining listeners who resonated with the message. I started interviewing guests, therapists, authors, and even people who had experienced their own relationship implosions and came out stronger on the other side. Every episode felt like a step forward, not just for me, but for the community that was forming around it. One day, as I wrapped up an episode, I received a message from someone unexpected: Melissa. I stared at the notification on my phone, unsure of what to do. It was a simple message, just a few words: I listened to the podcast. I'm glad you're doing better. For a moment, I felt a surge of old emotions, the pain, the anger, the hurt, but then, something surprising happened. I didn't feel the need to respond with bitterness or rehash the past. I didn't feel the need to respond at all. I closed the message and put the phone down. Melissa's chapter in my life was over. She was a part of my story, but she wasn't the whole story. And for the first time in a long time, I felt at peace with that. I wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time, it didn't feel so uncertain. I had found my footing again. I had found my voice. As I sat down to plan the next episode of After the Storm, I realized that maybe the best part of my life wasn't behind me after all. It was just beginning. A year had passed since After the Storm launched, and my life was unrecognizable compared to the wreckage I had once lived in. The podcast had taken on a life of its own, growing steadily and attracting a community of people who understood the pain of starting over. Every week, I connected with listeners who shared their own stories of heartache, resilience, and healing. It wasn't just a show anymore, it was a movement. One afternoon, as I wrapped up an episode recording, I took a moment to reflect on how far I had come. It wasn't just about the success of the podcast or the growing audience. It was about me. How I had finally learned to forgive myself, to let go of the anger and the bitterness that had once defined me. The old apartment no longer felt like a reminder of what I'd lost. It was my home now, my space, filled with new memories and new meaning. I had rearranged the furniture, painted the walls, and even started adding plants, a small act of nurturing life that symbolized how much I had grown. It wasn't just about moving on from Melissa and Greg. It was about finding myself again. I hadn't heard from Melissa since that brief message she sent after the podcast started. I didn't expect to. I knew she had moved on with her life, just as I had. From what I heard through mutual acquaintances, she was working on her own projects, the though none of them seemed to have gained the traction mind over matter had. But I no longer cared to follow her story. Our paths had diverged, and I was at peace with that. Greg, on the other hand, had disappeared from my radar completely. After his visit that day, we never spoke again. Maybe he was trying to rebuild his life too, maybe not. It didn't matter. What mattered was that I no longer carried the burden of their betrayal. I had left it behind, where it belonged. The biggest surprise in all of this was how much after the storm had changed me. When I started the podcast, I thought it was about helping others find closure and sharing my experiences so they wouldn't feel alone. But as it grew, I realized that I was the one who needed it the most. Each conversation, each guest, and each email from a listener had helped me heal, bit by bit. The process wasn't linear, but it was real. One evening, as I prepared to record another episode, I received a message from a new listener. She introduced herself as Rachel and explained how much the podcast had helped her through her own difficult breakup. As I read her words, something about her message struck a chord with me. It wasn't just the usual praise or appreciation for the content, it was the honesty and the depth of her story. I responded as I did with most listeners, thanking her for reaching out and offering some words of support. Over the next few weeks, we exchanged more messages. What started as brief, polite replies turned into longer conversations. I found myself looking forward to hearing from her, intrigued by her insight and perspective. It wasn't flirtation, at least, not at first. It was a genuine connection, one that I hadn't expected but welcomed all the same. Eventually, we decided to meet in person. It wasn't a date, not really, just two people who had found comfort in each other's stories, curious to see if that connection would translate beyond words on a screen. We met at a quiet cafe on a rainy Saturday afternoon. I arrived first, nervous but hopeful. When Rachel walked in, I recognized her immediately from the photo she had sent, a warm smile, bright eyes, and an energy that seemed to light up the room. Our conversation flowed effortlessly. We talked about everything: life, work, the pain of the past, and the hope for the future. There was something refreshing about the way we connected, something different from the strained conversations I had endured in the aftermath of my marriage's collapse. As the hours passed, I realized something: I wasn't afraid anymore. I wasn't holding back, waiting for the other shoe to drop, or worrying about being hurt again. I was just present. It felt good. After we parted ways, I walked home through the rain, a smile tugging at the corners of my mouth. I didn't know what would come of this new connection with Rachel, and I didn't feel the need to rush it or define it. All I knew was that I was finally open to the idea of something new, something real. Life, I had learned, wasn't about avoiding pain or controlling the outcome. It was about embracing the unknown, and trusting yourself enough to take the next step, even when you couldn't see the whole path. As I sat down to record the next episode of After the Storm, I felt a sense of peace settle over me. The journey wasn't over, not by a long shot. But I was no longer defined by the betrayals of my past, no longer trapped by the anger that had once consumed me. I was free, and for the first time in a long time, I was ready to see where life would take me next.